Hello and welcome to the Demographicast. This week I'm joined once again by Jack Street after his absence last week, and joined by Riley Hall as well this week. How are you both?
Good, thanks, mate.
Good, thank you. Yeah.
How you doing, Brett?
Yeah, not too bad. Not too bad.
Good.
I said
I was
last. Sorry, go on.
no. What are we? 20 seconds in, I'm already interrupting you. I'm saying before we started, I haven't done one of these in 2 weeks. It feels like ages since I was on one. So
Yeah, it was strange
it's good
doing one without you last week, but it's good.
I missed you too, mate.
Oh, it's beautiful.
So Riley is a student in international history and politics in the Northeast. You said. What made you want to go into that originally? Have you always been interested in politics?
Well, not always. I didn't just pop out the womb going, Jeremy Corbyn kind of thing. I was I became very interested in politics sort of around the time of the 2017 general election, as I think a lot of people of our generation did, because for the first time I was seeing something very different, a kind of anti-establishment challenge to the rhetoric, and so I became very interested in that. And I've always been interested in history, so I just thought, seems like a good duo.
Yeah. The majority of the people we have on, if we ask them when they first go into politics, they say either the 2016 referendum or 2017 election.
It's interesting, isn't it?
It is.
Like, for all the criticism that Corbyn gets, and there's a lot to be criticised. I think that there is something to be said for how that movement at the time, be it Corbyn or Momentum or the Labour Party of that era, sparked an interest in young people and got them involved in politics. I do think there's something to be said. They're probably in a way that a lot of political parties have failed to do for probably 30 years.
Yeah,
for sure.
Definitely.
So today I asked Riley if there was anything in particular that you wanted to talk about, and you said sort of populism in Europe, that you've got a particular interest in it. I wanted to sort of just start by giving a bit of a definition, I suppose, of populism. It was a quick Google search, and the definition of the term is a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by established elite groups. I found an article by the BBC that was talking about populism in Europe. I think it was from 2019, so it probably needs a bit of an update, especially given I think there's been a slight rise in populism, or at least in support for it over the last year. The article in the BBC said that obviously the governments like Hungary and Poland have sort of eroded the rule of law and sort of fundamental human rights. I think the examples of that are in Poland, the fact that the anti-abortion law came in recently that meant that that women can't get abortions there, and in Hungary they've been curtailing sort of LGBT rights, I think, for a while. According to this article, I was surprised. It says, according to the article, it said 68% of Hungarian voters voted for a populist party in the last election. But they've got two populist parties, so I think both fairly right wing. And
this is where I kind of wanted to jump in though, Brett, because I think it's important to this is a really complex topic, right? And it's important to make the distinction or have the understanding that populism in itself isn't an ideology; it's a way of doing politics.
Doesn't mean
I would argue
doesn't mean left wing.
No, exactly. I would argue that those that specifically the Law and Order Party in Poland is, or Law and Justice, party in Poland is a borderline. Well, I would say that they're a regressive far right party. I would say that they do politics in a populist way. But I would say that the underpinning ideology is borderline authoritarian, and far right wing. That's how I would sort of describe that ideology, and that's where the difficulty comes in like pinpointing what populism is, because Bernie Sanders is a populist.
Yeah.
Right. So then it's difficult then to talk about that party in Poland and the policies that are brought in, and sort of something that Bernie Sanders would say that somebody on the populist left. So I think it's important to make that clarification, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to end up sort of asking questions like, what obviously, can populism be a good thing? Because I think we would probably argue that it can. Just to point out, though, because I thought this article was interesting, that I think it covered mostly European Union countries, although it left out some of the Baltic states for some reason. I'm not entirely sure why. But I thought it was interesting to see that over 20% of voters in Austria, Switzerland, Denmark, and Belgium voted for populist parties, and then over 10%. So that ranges from 10% to 19% of voters in Estonia, Finland, Sweden, Italy, Spain, France, the Netherlands, Germany, and the Czech Republic all voted for populist parties in their last elections. And then obviously, we've kind of witnessed populism taking hold of the sort of the winning party's narrative here in the UK as well over the last few years, but specifically in the last election and in the referendum as well. Well, first of all, Riley, I wanted to just sort of ask you, given that you're so interested in the topic, why you think people in Europe specifically have been so attracted to populism in the last in the last decade or two.
Well, I think it kind of stems from two things, and it's important not to oversimplify, because people are weird and complex. But to put it academically, but they essentially, I think it boils down to a number of things. The biggest one being economics. I think since 2008, there's been a massive increase in populism, and to argue that wasn't a factor, I think is a little bit naive, because what people saw across Europe and to an extent in America and in some other countries as well, some developing countries, was that governments, whether they were centre left or centre right or smack bang in the centre, when they responded to the crisis, the vast majority of them implemented austerity policies. And so people were kind of looking at the situation like, hang on, these bankers did this and now we're paying for it and they're getting off scot-free. And I think that's kind of a primary motivation for it. And when you look at the rise of populism in any period, whether it's, in the 30s or, when the term was kind of where it originates in ancient Greece, it always comes from a period of decline, when people are kind of wanting a major change because it doesn't feel like the establishment's listening. And I think that's the primary reason. And then, of course, how that populism manifests is a different matter. It can be left-wing targeting, very, very rich people and redistribution of wealth and things, or it can be, right-wing with targeting minorities and immigrants and so on.
Mm-hmm. Jack,
I would agree. I think that sort of disenfranchisement from the traditional way of doing politics is probably the predominant factor as to why individuals seek an alternative. I think that it's in many ways, I think on a base level, and this is why, again, I think it's important to make a distinction between what people say and what they do. I think Nigel Farage managed to tap into people who were rightly disenfranchised from the political system, people who didn't see them and their views being represented in Westminster, and tapped into that for what I would argue would be sinister means, and means that really didn't represent the views of those people. So I think it comes from, or the want for a difference, the want for populism, if you will, comes from an important place, and a place that I think the Labour Party at the moment would be well suited to tapping into. I think that you have to look at the reasons for why people voted for Brexit, for why Boris Johnson won, for why people voted for Donald Trump, and say that the systems that we have aren't working for a lot of ordinary people. We need to change that. The problem comes when you look at politics and you look at people's motivations, and that is seen as a tool to get into power. And then what people do in power is very different from what they said they were going to do when they were being elected, or the people that they represent really aren't the working person. It's the elites, it's business as usual. And I think that's best shown in Donald Trump. I think, the whole drain the swamp movement, the America First rhetoric was great for getting him into power. But when he was in power, he governed like a neoconservative establishment, business as usual politician. There was really, nothing that he did that was aimed at those people. So I think it comes from, I think it's important to realize that the populism comes from a place that's important, but often it's more crucial to look at politicians' actions rather than their rhetoric and their words.
Do either of you know of any examples of people who have used quite populist narratives in their election campaigns or whatever, and have then followed up with those with not regressive policies, I suppose, or not used it for their own means?
A good example would maybe be the New Deal, FDR. I think that would probably be a good example. You know, a politician who said, you know, that this is what America needed, that this is what a new sort of industrial deal, a kind of massive amount of investment and growth was needed, and they'll follow through on that after they were elected. And you know, it's a difficult one to answer, because I guess some people would suggest that maybe Donald Trump, he tried to build the wall. You know, like is that the kind of, you know, it depends what your standards are for that kind of thing, right? It's, you know, Boris Johnson, I guess, delivered some kind of Brexit.
Sure.
You know, so what are your, you know, how high are your standards? But I would say that, yeah, FDR is a good example of that. I think there are probably Norwegian countries that probably don't fall into, or Scandinavian countries, sorry, that don't fall into necessarily the populist, like the traditional populist way of doing things, but their way of doing politics is far more promising and then delivering. So yeah, there are definitely examples. There are definitely examples of that. I don't know if you've got anything that's clearer, Riley.
You know, that's, to be honest, that was the only thing I could think of, because it is actually very hard, isn't it, to think of a populist movement that's resulted in the change they were actually talking about. I think the only other one I can think of is Theodore Roosevelt. You know, he was, when he obviously he kind of inherited the presidency as the vice president when William McKinley was assassinated, but when he ran for his second term, he was kind of railing against the elites and the monopolies, and obviously he was a big trust buster and everything. So I'd say him to an extent, but he was more of a populist when he ran for the Progressive Party, for the Bull Moose Party, and then obviously he didn't win. So
why do we?
I would say that that's an issue with all political parties. I wouldn't say that it was sort of like a populist issue, right? I would say that you would struggle to find many political parties that deliver everything that they set out in their manifesto. I think that, or even a large proportion of that.
Why do we think that they seem to be so? The majority, at least in Europe, seem to be right wing. Though the ones that adopt these populist, narratives. Any ideas? Any theories?
That's a good question. I
mean, to be honest, I think it comes, I think, from a place of, I suppose, the current power structures that are in place. If you think about, you know, the kind of political and economic and media kind of establishment, as it were, they stand to lose a lot from a left-wing populist movement, because the left-wing populist movement generally, you know, as we saw in 2017 with Jeremy Corbyn and 2019, 2016, 2020 with Bernie Sanders, and, you know, Podemos in Spain, and the list goes on, they actually will redistribute wealth and power away from, you know, this tiny group of very, very wealthy individuals to the majority of the population. And whether or not you agree with their policies, that does represent a threat to those people's influence. And so when anger is being directed somewhere, I think it's more likely that the political and media atmosphere will be less hostile towards right-wing populists, because they'll essentially, they don't really fundamentally challenge that. I mean, look at Trump. Did he fundamentally challenge the status quo of the United States? You know, arguably not, until he went crazy and decided to try and overthrow the election. So, you know, I think that that's kind of the main reasoning for it. I think that basically those views are more viewed as more legitimate, vilifying, you know, immigrants and feminists and communists and, you know, whatever else.
Yeah, I agree. I think that generally the right are better at delivering those messages than the left are, particularly in sort of when looking at political parties, and maybe less so individuals. But I think that the right have been better at sort of attacking the left, woke people, whatever that means, sort of stoking this idea of a culture war. I think that unless you're looking at Bernie Sanders, who I think is probably the best example in the West of kind of anti-establishment politician, a true anti-establishment sort of populist left politician, it's far easier to create that rhetoric. I mean, I was the other day chatting to my mum, and we were sort of having a meeting, and I was pretending, to play that side, right, and just sort of like winding my mum up. And it's incredibly easy, and it's also very fun. So I can see why people are attracted into playing that side. There's a lot of clout in it, especially these days. What was your question, Brett?
What was my question? Oh,
it was
the majority are right wing. Why do you think the majority are right wing?
Yeah.
Because like Riley pointed out, I think that the sort of particularly the media establishment, especially in this country, controls that narrative from that side. So you're going to get a platform far easier if you decide to take that side. You just have to look at the Meghan and Harry sort of debate that's raging,
which we'll
through.
Get to
You can be somebody that just calls themselves a royal expert or a royal correspondent, as long as you toe the right line. There's examples of young people. We think it's great that young people are getting a platform, but when you look at individuals like Tom Harwood or Darren Grimes, who essentially have been given a platform to espouse the Tory party line, and not really seemingly come up with any individual thoughts. They take a line, everybody knows they're going to take that line, they get clout for it, they're pretty happy, sort of just towing that line. They have to apologize every now and then when they platform a racist, but they get given that platform, they get funded, and it's fairly easy to do that. It's far more difficult to speak truth to power. There's far less in it, and it's a far longer road. So I think that's probably why. And it's electorally, it's a great tactic. It's a great tactic. Let's not forget, when looking at the Trump-Biden election, that without COVID, Biden probably would have lost in a landslide. Trump was able to oversee a sort of civil unrest and one of probably the worst response to the pandemic in the world, and still get the second most votes of any president in history. That's pretty damning, and I think it's a good message to right-wing populists around the world.
Yeah, which is why it's confusing, because I think we'd argue, or I mean, I'd argue that Trump didn't, or it was the elite himself. He played into that narrative when he was campaigning, that he would drain the swamp and get rid of all these people in power that weren't fighting for the American people, or that weren't doing anything that would benefit them, and then got into power. And I mean, I think it was pretty obvious that he was going to get into power and not do anything to really help the poor and working class people of America. But I'm intrigued to know if populism works, but I think it's only theory, because we don't really have an example of it. But I would be interested to know. To me, it would have been really interesting to see Bernie Sanders up against Trump, because it would have been left-wing populism against right-wing populism. And I mean, you could probably argue, I guess, that the reason that Bernie Sanders wasn't selected as the candidate was because he was challenging this elite, and even the Democratic Party in America, I think, likes the way it is. I don't think it wants
the DNC primaries both times were rigged, so it's. I mean, that's important to bear in mind, and it's sort of academic, right? We'll never know. We can look at polling, however much you trust polling, and throughout the both the primary polling and pre-primary election polling, by all accounts, Sanders was projected to smash Trump, and that was even pre-pandemic. So would have been amazing to see.
For sure.
Riley, what do you think about sort of the electoral chances of left-wing parties without adopting that approach?
without adopting
Yeah.
that approach. I think they're very, very slim. I think it paints a very grim picture. I think, unfortunately, we're not living in an age where people generally think things are going to get better. Most people like things are going to either stay bad or they're going to get worse, right? And that's with regards to employment, climate change, even things like fake news or automation. Everything just feels like it's getting worse. Basically, I think for a lot of people, they feel left behind. And if the left kind of tries to be very technocratic about their solutions, I think they'll fail. Like you said, Joe Biden, I mean, was giving some very, very limited policies. The most radical thing he was talking about was, like a $15 minimum wage, which, if you adjust for inflation and worker productivity changes since the 60s, that would be $24 an hour in America. So,
they even failed to pass that $15 minimum wage recently.
Yeah.
As well,
so clearly, and he would have. I think we all agree he probably would have lost if it hadn't been for the pandemic.
I believe so. Yeah.
And because he was just a slightly more likable Hillary Clinton, and I'm not sure that was enough.
Yeah.
So I think the left doesn't really stand much of a chance in doing that, because people want a challenge. People feel totally disenfranchised, and if you say, well, actually that's divisive and we need to be nice and civil, and and people are just going to be like, well, sod you, because I don't think these people are representing me. And if you're saying, well, actually it's not that bad, then I won't vote for you. So I think I think it's a big risk, and I think that's a risk that the Labour Party is taking right now.
That's going to be my next question. Sort of, what do you think of the strategy that the Labour Party is adopting? Like, what do you think about Keir Starmer in general? I'm sort of interested to know.
Well, it was interesting actually, because I supported the Labour Party in 2017, 2019. I think
Are you a member?
I am a member, yeah. Kind of a bit sort of reluctantly at the moment, but I think that's how pretty much everyone feels. But
yeah,
I knew that there were problems with Jeremy Corbyn, and I knew that he'd done things wrong, and I knew that Labour's kind of optics were often a bit dodgy, and they basically didn't kind of act in a way that presented themselves in the best light and gave their policies across in kind of a very slick way. I thought Keir Starmer was essentially going to have a slightly more moderate version of the politics of like the 2017 manifesto, with the kind of the charisma and electability of Tony Blair. And it was kind of the other way around. And I was going to have the politics of Tony Blair and the electability of Jeremy Corbyn. And I feel a bit lied to. I didn't. He wasn't my first choice, actually. My first choice was Lisa Nandy. And to be honest, I didn't really like any of them. But so I think Labour's strategy, what I thought it was going to be, was kind of an anti-establishment strategy that was more effective, more polished, and more streamlined. But what they're doing instead, I think, is a very technocratic, moderate, just totally bland approach. I think Starmer's first sort of like year on the job really hasn't been very promising. But there was a period of 2020 where Labour were gaining a lot in the polls. People were saying, oh, this guy, I could maybe vote for him. But after that point, I think people started to see the cracks showing, as the policies just never came. There was nothing substantive ever. I mean, the most substantive thing we've got has been like votes at 16 and a recovery bond.
Yeah.
So I think it's kind of a recipe for disaster, to be honest.
Yeah, not exactly sexy policies. I mean, votes at 16, 17 is interesting, but yeah, they don't get me going. And I think that would be your criticism, right, Brett?
Yeah.
Be bland, I think, is a good way of describing it.
Definitely bland. And like, if we're talking about populism and how it kind of baffles me that the Labour Party isn't going down that route, because the atmosphere that I get at the moment in the UK generally, but especially with more left wingers, is that they don't trust the media. They don't trust the people in power. The elite are people that they can't, that are, we've spoken so many times about the one rule for them and a different for us. It's that kind of thing seems to be happening constantly, especially recently, like with the royal family stuff. It baffles me that you wouldn't, as a left-wing party, try and go down that route, because I feel like that it's pretty obvious that people want to push back against this elite, and with all these inequalities coming out during the last year, being have it being laid bare in front of us, just baffling to me that they wouldn't try and cash in on that, even from a political standpoint. Not necessarily a moral one, but yeah.
Look
and it's not even just about the. Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, look back to 2017, probably the last. You can't really call losing successful, but sort of semi-triumph was probably the 2017 general election, where that was the route that was taken. 2019 obviously was far more Brexit heavy, but really felt like ground was being made up. And obviously there were catalogue of errors and poor leadership from Jeremy Corbyn and the cabinet and the sort of upper echelons of the Labour Party between that time. But that strategy, highlighting the weaknesses of government, showing how incompetent and inept they are and how corrupt they are, never will there be a better time to highlight that stuff than now. And never has probably the mood of the nation kind of directed in that way. And we've, I think, already missed the boat as a party, because as soon as the vaccine is fully rolled out, as soon as people are getting pints down their neck in Wetherspoons again, it'll probably all be forgotten. We have very, very short memories in this country, and we didn't get on the train, early enough, anywhere near early enough. And it's probably too late now. And I've said throughout the pandemic, if there's an inquiry and the Labour Party start chiming in and saying, awful leadership, I will sit here and say, you could have fucking spoken up when people were dying. You could have raised your voice when people couldn't say goodbye to their loved ones and they were in hospital. You could have fought a bit harder throughout this period, and not just started speaking up when it was easy. And I agree. I think that it's a problem that many of us can see, which really is why it boggles me, and I think probably you two as well, that they haven't also noticed it. Two policy announcements for a new leadership, a new Labour Party leadership in a national crisis. Not one, but two. The pandemic and the recession is not good enough. Why not go down that road? There's enough things to complain about, right? There's enough things to pin your colours to and say that we don't like this, we don't agree with this. So it's strange.
Yeah, for sure. Any final thoughts on that tool, or shall I move on to current events?
Can I just say one thing? I think something that is really lacking in the Labour Party right now is a desire to shift the Overton window. They certainly not to the left. They seem to not understand that. When Jeremy Corbyn was elected leader of the Labour Party in 2015, I remember me and my dad talking about it. Obviously, I was only 13. I didn't really know anything about politics, but we were just chatting about it, and he was like, "Yeah, it's a shame because it would be nice, wouldn't it? But someone like that's never going to come close to power." And I was like, "Yeah, it's a shame. Yeah, blah blah." And then when 2017 rolled around, we were like, "Well, Labour are going to get smashed," and then back to centrist Labour Party, right?
Yeah.
But because of that kind of momentous populist leftism being actually what most of the public agreed with on a policy by policy basis, and it coming together in an effective vision while the Conservatives were running a horrendously bad, very right-wing campaign, the ground was shifted. Things changed in a big way. And now the Labour Party doesn't seem to understand that, that was because of them. They did that. And if they keep doing that, they could push the government towards better things. I mean, even if they don't win, the Conservatives are implementing more Keynesian economic policy. And I would argue the biggest influence on that is the Labour Party. They knew they'd shifted the Overton window. So I think Labour are really missing an opportunity there. And they're almost kind of, by being so tepid, they're almost kind of allowing it to shift further right, which is just bonkers. But...
Yeah, like flanking the Tories on the right with the corporation tax rises. It's like
Yeah.
the basis of that policy or that decision was that the Labour Party would be in favour of raising um, corporation tax when the pandemic ended. But if you can't see how easily that is spun, I mean, you're paying people top money to be aware of this stuff and come up with responses. And I can sit here in my bedroom and tell you, if I was a Tory party member or if I was Boris Johnson, I'm going to be saying, um, I'm going to be aware that the Labour Party membership aren't going to be happy with that. I would question why those people are in those positions. To be perfectly honest with you,
Yeah.
but yeah,
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think you're totally right, Riley.
Let's move on to our first current event topic of today, which is a pretty big topic at the moment. Couldn't really avoid talking about it.
You know what? Before you move on, right? I've got a group chat with friends from school, and one of my friends was watching the interview last night, and put in the chat and said, "Is anybody watching Harry and Meghan? Take the royal family to task?" And one of my friends genuinely went, "No, what's going on?" And I was like, "Do you live under a rock? How can you not be aware of this?"
Well, this is why we should talk about it then. For
Yeah,
people
exactly,
who
yeah.
not
We're really drilling into the news stories that have gone under the radar.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, raising awareness.
Yeah.
So, as a quick recap, as of today, so it's Tuesday the 9th, the Harry and Meghan interview with Oprah Winfrey aired last night on British television, though I think a lot of us knew what it was going to contain already from it being released in America the day before. They talk about their experiences with the royal family throughout their relationship, and interesting because I don't know if Harry at all talks about before Meghan joined the tool or was she was in the picture, and I'd be interested to know if he's got any other insight about the royal family from before she was part of his life. But anyway, they basically dropped a bomb. People are describing it as them dropping bombshells on the royal family because they bring up things like Meghan's suicidal thoughts that she was having during her pregnancy with Archie because of the pressure being within the royal family, and the fact that she received no support after asking senior members as well as the institution for help. The response I think she was given was something along the lines of, "We've all had to deal with it, so can you."
Yeah.
They bring up the fact that there were discussions amongst royal family members. I think one in particular talked about how that raised the question about how dark Archie's skin would be when he was born, which is baffling. And other things like Prince Charles, I think, apparently has stopped speaking to Harry for a time at least after they left the UK. They did say stuff like their relationships with I think Harry's relationship with the Queen seems to be stronger than ever, apparently, from what he was saying, especially with his two grandparents, I think. And he did confirm that neither the Queen nor Prince Philip made the comments about Archie's skin colour, because I think a lot of people might have jumped to the conclusion that it was Prince Philip, given his background. So where do both of you stand on this topic?
I mean, like, I think it for me it reaffirms my kind of, I don't even know what the right word is, but not even frustration, but just kind of apathy with the royal family. Have never been a fan, have never really understood being a fan of a family because they're the head of state or because they were born. You come out of the right vagina and all of a sudden you've got 75% of the country praising you no matter what you do. I think that they are an out-of-date institution that is in desperate need of reform. And I kind of said, like, West Ham were playing last night, so I didn't watch the interview last night. But I kind of said and assumed, and I think rightly after watching it, that it was calm, honest, interesting. There were obviously bits that were pretty horrific and pretty shocking, but I think it's amazing that they've come out and spoken out about sort of their position. And I would like the royal family, if there are members of the royal family or members of the institution who disagree, to communicate openly and honestly as well, because that's what the rest of us do, for the most part. That's what we require. We should require politicians to do in these situations, is be accountable and communicate honestly and openly. I think the main thing that is highlighted to me is that we have a pretty awful media in this country, and again, one that is in huge need of change and properly challenging, particularly the print media. Some of the stuff that's been printed, I'm sure we'll come on to Piers Morgan, just completely unhinged, essentially driving people to either feel suicidal or commit suicide. We can't be okay with that as a country. We can't be. And these papers that are owned by probably 3 people, the most read papers in the country, probably the 5 or 6 papers that are most read, owned by 3 people, dictate what the majority of the country think. And when they're all chiming off saying the same stuff or similar stuff, that isn't good. That isn't healthy. So that would be my main takeaway, to be honest. And Brett, I know that you've got an issue with the conversation being focused around people like Piers Morgan, but I think it's important to at least talk about our dissatisfaction, if we are dissatisfied with it, our dissatisfaction with the media in this country as well.
Sure. I just wanted to bring up, you mentioned that you think that the royal family should be more open about this. And I've heard the argument made that if they do that, then they're no longer this, family that people look up to and that they revere. They're just, they come off as normal human beings, which I would argue they should be. They are,
yeah.
But that's not the image that they're trying to put forward. So
no.
Oh, maybe the Queen's a lizard person. Who knows?
Exactly. Well, yeah, there is that. That's true. Yeah, very good point.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really weird situation, because I know people who like the monarchy, who actually feel very sympathetic towards Meghan and Harry, and obviously they're not racist, and so they feel, if that's true, if that is true, what she said, and I believe it is, but obviously a lot of people are saying, oh, she's just lying, about what was said about Archie. That's vile.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And I think, but I also know people who don't like the royal family, but view Meghan and Harry as just being, as being hypocrites, or wanting the kind of media attention. And I think the reason that so many people kind of view her negatively is just exactly like Jack said. It's just about when you have a media who are so strangely obsessed with the royal family. When someone does something even remotely new, when someone is seen as an outsider in any capacity, then they can dictate what the country thinks. I mean, you're right. It's something like 3 people own like 2/3 of the media in the country. I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, if you ask me, it's very undemocratic, and we shouldn't have a media like that. But I think it's really quite disturbing how easily people can turn a blind eye to what is quite clearly harassment and racism, because the media kind of just tells them that someone is kind of disrespecting our country in some abstract way.
Yeah. And it just brings out the absolute worst in people, these discussions. And essentially what we're doing, obviously I appreciate the question in terms of getting the discussion going, but with all of this stuff, it's like giving me a synopsis of my next door neighbor's life and then going, tell me what you think, take a side.
Yeah.
It's like, what? How can you expect people to do that? We've really got no idea what's going on behind closed doors. You can listen to what people say, and I've got no reason to not believe Meghan. I don't really see why they would both come out and make that stuff up, and by all accounts they haven't made it up. You certainly wouldn't lie about feeling suicidal, I don't think. So why anybody would disbelieve her, let alone actively try to get people to not believe her and believe that she has ulterior motives with no evidence whatsoever, is beyond me. And this obsession with both the royal family, but also picking a side in people's lives and not just listening to what they have to say and going, there's some bad bits. I think that there's some bad bits, there's some good bits, and I think that the really important part is that this is crucial because the royal family are the figureheads of the country. They are supposed to set the example for how the rest of the country behaves, if you will. And when you have members of that family making comments like that, or treating their family members in that way, that's when I think that there becomes a real issue, which is why I think that the royal family is in need of reform. Is because they clearly aren't working properly as an institution. They're not, certainly isn't suitable for the 21st century, in my view. And to come on to Riley, what you were saying about the media and breaking the media up and it being undemocratic, it almost certainly is. I think if you were formulating a society, from scratch, or at least a democratic society, a fair democratic society, you certainly wouldn't be comfortable with 80% of the media being owned by three people, or the print media being owned by three people. It's definitely not something that you would want. So something that, coming back to the Labour Party campaign and or the Labour Party is should be a core focus for them, in my view. Breaking up these media monopolies and trying to have more transparent communication. And I think this highlights that. I think the pandemic has highlighted that, but this story in particular does a good job of it. Brett, let's come on to the sort of need for the monarchy discussion, because I've been looking forward to getting into this all week. Do you think abolish the monarchy has been trending on Twitter? Do you think that this discussion has added more credence to that argument? So not necessarily, I'd like to sort of get into your thoughts as to whether you think we should abolish the monarchy, but do you think that this case has added credence to that movement?
Yeah, without a doubt, I think it has. Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at it objectively, I think that obviously, something like this is going to spur on anyone who is anti-monarchy to use it as a reason to abolish it. But my main concern for the royal family recently, I mean, obviously there have been stories about sort of the Queen and Prince Charles recently in The Guardian. I think we covered it on this podcast, saying that they were influencing certain legislation to stop them from displaying their incomes, or not incomes, but their finances publicly, and that sort of thing. But from a moral standpoint, and I think that this interview raises gives a lot of credence to the moral perspective. The royal family and its institution is incredibly out of touch, incredibly old-fashioned. They clearly do not care very much for mental health, and I think that's probably one of the big reasons why we saw Prince William and Prince Harry several years ago come out and talk about their mental health experiences and start charities based on them, because they weren't necessarily getting the support within the institution itself. And I mean, we've heard obviously of cases in the past where certain other royal family members have not been supported by the institution, and Meghan coming out now is of no surprise to anyone, I don't think, when she says that she's not maybe it is a surprise to people who think that the royal family have tried to support mental health services and that, or that they've come out and recognized how important mental health is, but it's not reflected in how they act clearly towards their own family members. That, and what we've already mentioned, the fact that they aren't treated as human beings, and doing that, I think, leads to them being particularly damaged people. I don't think you can grow up in an atmosphere like that without coming out being, pretty fucked up. And they've got, obviously, this isn't even getting onto the whole Prince Andrew conversation either.
Oh yeah, Jesus Christ! Yeah.
Like, all these different things are incredibly morally bankrupt. And do we really want a head of state or a family that represents us as a country, that a lot of people seem to identify with, or maybe not identify with, but support, blindly follow? Do we really want them or at least in the current form, as a beacon of
British values?
Yeah, a beacon of British values. Yeah,
I think it's a strong argument. Riley, you got any thoughts on this?
It's interesting because I used to be one of those people who, if you ask them about the royals, I'll be like, oh, well, they bring so much money because of tourism. Just let them stay.
So did I. Yeah.
Yeah, but over the last kind of couple of years, the more research you do into it, the more you realize that's actually kind of not true. And even if it was, that's not really the point, is it? If someone said, if we shoot 10% of the population, then everyone will be rich. You'd be like, well, we still shouldn't do that, even though it's good for the economy. So it's one of those situations where it's about, it's a question of what does it say about us as a country? And I think, the world's kind of looking at us now thinking, what are they doing?
Yeah.
Why on earth, 21st century, why do you have an aristocratic monarchy that's, in a position? Because whilst the Queen has limited powers and all of that, it's still an institution that has an immense influence.
Yeah.
And as you said earlier, it's got immense influence even over policy now because of lobbying. And I think it's kind of ridiculous that someone who represents us can't be chosen by us. And so I think we should probably have, an elected head of state instead.
I think the moral arguments are strong and fairly difficult to disagree with, to be honest. I think there are sort of logistical and democratic and constitutional arguments to having a monarchy. The one that I often bring up to Brett when we have this debate off podcasts, and we often spend our time debating these issues off of podcasts, is a Stephen Fry kind of proposition, and that is the top 5 happiest, wealthiest, most equal countries in the world are all monarchical democracies. Scandinavian countries have a monarchy, and they are some of the most free, open, democratic countries in the world. So it isn't impossible to have a monarchy and be an open, democratic society. It is possible, and the sort of logistics in abolishing the monarchy and setting up a new system, whilst that might not be, like you say, a sort of good enough argument to not do it, are huge, and there would need to be a very, very strong case put forward as to how we would improve our system by doing that. I think that there are things that can be done whilst the monarchy are in place that would make a bigger difference. Reforming the electoral system, having an elected second chamber. These being the 2 crucial ones. I think that there are sort of like media laws that need to be brought in, regulation that needs to be brought in. I have major issues with how the monarchy functions, and I think that this is a really important debate in terms of how best we can formulate as a society, and I think it's one that we need to have, which is why it's so ridiculous that it gets shut down so quickly every time it comes up, because people are so tribal. But I don't know if I'm fully there yet. I definitely think there needs to be reform. The monarchy aren't subject to freedom of information requests, which is ridiculous. That's absolutely crazy, particularly considering the Prince Andrew stuff, which we should probably talk about more on this show, to be honest.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I would want to reform is that they aren't audited by the National Audit Office. Again, ridiculous. They are, I would argue, a public institution. They all of their wealth comes from us, essentially, whether that be the property that they own, or the sort of sovereign purse that the Treasury then gives back to them. So that needs to change. They need to be audited. There's major issues with tax avoidance in the royal family, but oftentimes we can't do these things, or we can't tackle these issues, because if you say anything bad about the Queen, you're automatically branded a traitor, which is, of course, insane. So removing those filters from these conversations is crucial, and we need to have them because the country obviously isn't working properly.
Yeah, for sure. And it makes me wonder, I think a lot of people have been sort of saying with what's been happening with the Meghan and Harry conversation, as soon as the people are incredibly fond of the Queen because obviously she's
Yeah.
our longest reigning monarch, and
Because of The Crown.
well, the TV series. I mean, I think it dates back for like even my grandparents,
Yeah, of course it does,
especially
yeah.
my grandparents.
Yeah.
They are incredibly, they're not exactly
of course.
monarchists, but they're very fond of her and they respect her.
Yeah.
What happens when she dies is the question, because I don't think as many
Yes.
people respect Prince Charles.
Well, this is the argument that the Reform, or not Reform, but the Republic Party put forward, is that these reforms should happen when the Queen dies.
Right.
That's the best place to put them. So they argue that the monarchy should be abolished, and they say that the best time to do that is when the Queen dies. And they're going to start their campaign after the Queen dies, which I'm sure will get them lots of positive publicity.
Yeah.
As soon as the Queen pops her clogs, they're out there campaigning to abolish the monarchy. That's probably it'll be interesting to see what Piers Morgan's reaction to that is. What I wanted to add to this though was that I've seen some of the most ridiculous takes in my life over the last 2 days. One of my favourites was regarding Charles not picking up Harry's calls, and David Dimbleby actually on BBC said Charles might have been out the house. Seriously, yeah. He was on, and people went, interesting, that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about that one. It's like, really, that's the state that we're in. Like,
assuming that when Harry brought that up,
he wasn't home.
Yeah, assuming that when Harry brought that up, he meant one phone call when Charles wasn't out of the house, or wasn't in the house. And
you can imagine Charles sprinting through Buckingham Palace and trying to get to the other end to answer the phone. Absolutely crazy, Like, obviously, there's been this spoof panel that was set up with all these so-called royal correspondents that come on and haven't even seen the interview yet. They've got these long opinions on it, and they're being asked what they thought of some of Oprah's questions that these sort of fake interviewers had made up, and they're answering them as if they were real. Just completely crazy. Yeah. So I mean, it's highlighted so many issues, so many kind of areas that need focus. Some obviously more serious than others, but we are a laughingstock in so many ways in this country at the moment.
Yeah, let's just keep adding to the list, shall we?
Yeah, why not? Yeah.
Going to move quickly on to the next current events topic, but I know that we're running a slightly long time, so let's try and keep it quickly. Try and keep it quickly. Yeah. Jesus, try and keep it short. It's based on, so because it was International Women's Day yesterday, this isn't exactly a particularly positive story, but it needs to be talked about. I saw an article in The Guardian yesterday that said that half of women in the UK fear equality is going back to the 1970s, according to a survey. It says that people are afraid that, or women, are due to being more likely to have been furloughed over the last year, to have lost their jobs, to carrying the burden of domestic, homeschooling and domestic chores, that it looks to them, or they feel like they've been pushed back in terms of gender equality progress. I was reading how this survey says 70% of mothers with male partners are doing all or most of the homeschooling during the pandemic. 73% of respondents saying they did all of or most of the laundry, they did the food shopping, and they did all or most of the cleaning and tidying up. Obviously, women across the country are very frustrated by this, and I think it's a matter for all of us to be frustrated with, because what does it say as a society when an event like the one that's happened over the past year occurs, and instantly any of the progress that's been made over the last few decades is reversed in those respects, and more importantly, that people don't necessarily acknowledge it, from people saying that of course things have been far better now than they were in the 70s. There's no way that people are that we're regressing, or you're just being sensitive.
Yeah,
it's quite sad. I don't know if either of you have any thoughts or like on what needs to be done to prevent this from happening, or to prevent this from worsening, but also from happening again in further crises like this where for some reason we revert automatically to that, because it shows that we haven't broken past that barrier. Is it that we're lacking certain legislation, like there's not enough like maybe like it's tied in with legislation like paternity leave and that sort of thing, that it's not equal to maternity leave, and or that gender the pay gap perhaps is also something to think about. But any thoughts? I know it's a lot rolled into one there, but what do you think needs to be done?
So from my point of view,
to prevent this?
From my point of view, this is societal, right? This is about gender norms, and the reality of these things is that they only change over time, and that they will never be fully equal. And much like, be careful how I phrase this, because I obviously don't want to. I think that you can't legislate for this stuff, as frustrating as it is, and as unequal as it might be, as it probably is. I think that there are certain entrenched stereotypes, and these things are getting better, but they change over time, and that happens with education, and that happens with having more conversations about this stuff. But it's a slow process, and what we need to ensure that we're doing is carrying the conversation forward and continuing to break down these barriers. And that isn't something that I even believe that is the role of government to do. I think things like paternity leave, it's important to tackle those changes. I think that there are legislative changes that can be made there, and I think they're really important ones. And oftentimes these things are more influential in things like the pay gap than straight up sexism is, even though it's a factor. So it's important that those are tackled properly. But things like domestic chores, like women doing more domestic chores and cooking and that kind of thing, I think our generation will continue to change those, because I think we view this stuff in a different way. But I think it's a slow battle and it's frustrating. But that's kind of where I stand on it. I don't know how we can accelerate that process apart from having more conversations around it.
Sure. I mean, I guess what I would say to that, though, is that the survey also brings up the fact that a lot of women have been furloughed or lost jobs over the pandemic as well, which I don't think is that doesn't seem societal to me necessarily. Or I guess it is, but not in the same way as the fact that women might. I'm assuming that when we're thinking about women reverting to domestic chores or to being more likely to do them, it's older generations of women. But if the younger generations of women, which I know for a fact that younger women have been more affected than younger men when it comes to losing jobs and being furloughed over the last year, how is that? Why is that happening?
I don't know. I can't answer that question.
Sure.
So it's interesting to look into, and I think that we need to get to the bottom of these kind of, if you want to call them systemic inequalities. I can't answer that, and I also don't have those experiences. It's probably not best place to give my answer, and there will always be an element of ignorance. But so I think it's important to center women's experiences in these conversations, and I think that's kind of with our International Women's Day content yesterday. That's what we tried to do, and push these conversations forward throughout the year, and not just have them on a day or in a month. Riley, I don't know if you've got anything that you'd like to add to that.
Well, to be honest, I do think there's legislation that can be implemented. To be honest, I think the state can solve any problem, but not in the way that a lot of people might think. I think you either directly solve it or you make it a lot easier for people to choose the right option themselves. And this is one of those ones. You can't literally say to people, do the dishes, don't just let your wife do. It's not something like that. You have to change the culture. But I think an important thing is this kind of anti-woke. I mean, I hate that word, but this kind of shift, I think, that's occurred online, where I think even like our generation is kind of being slightly more, I don't know, it's like the kind of egalitarian viewpoints of people and feminism and things. I mean, I'm sure you'll have seen all the many feminists gets wrecked by logic and facts and stuff.
Yeah.
compilations on YouTube.
Some of my favorite videos.
Yeah, it's every night before bed, watch at least 5. Ben Shapiro's sweet voice. But those kind of things do have a big impact, and so I think it kind of reinforces this idea that actually women's equality is just a load of crap. It doesn't, like, either ignoring the issue altogether or actively thinking, well, they kind of should be in that position. And I think that's a growing problem, and the way you kind of legislate against that is by kind of cracking down on hate speech online and cracking down on data mining, and because those things get used by algorithms to pinpoint people's exact political pressure points.
Sure.
And kind of turn them against some very common sense egalitarian views. But it's very sad. And the irony is not lost that we're 3 guys talking about this.
Sure.
But
right, exactly, precisely. But I can tell you that it's certainly changed in my house over the years, and we do the way that it works in my house, especially when it comes to like meals and washing up and stuff, is that like we each take a day to cook. So like last night was my night, and then the person that cooked the night before washes up, so I'll wash up tonight, and it's having that rotation. And I think that those small changes, like taking this minute example, drilling in that stuff from an early age, saying that this stuff has to be done and it's not the job of mum or whoever to do that, is important. And I think where, like you say, where legislation comes in, it is things like paternity leave, closing these gaps, expanding choices for people. And I think that there needs to be, this. I think we really need to tackle how we perceive gender roles. I think that that's incredibly important. Like the stigma around a man not working, being a stay-at-home dad, for example, there is a stigma that revolves around that, and I think that that needs to be challenged. And I think that men have a large part to play in those, in tackling those gender norms, because we don't do a good enough job of either bringing our mates up when they bring them up, or challenging them in the workplace. There's a story, I know I hate to bring him up again, but there was this on Good Morning Britain this morning, fucking Piers Morgan getting a co-worker to stand up to talk about how short her skirt was on live TV. He was like, did you not see this, Riley? He said I got distracted this morning because I can't remember her name, which is really bad of me, but it said her name and she was sat at the desk. It was wearing such a short skirt. Stand up, let everybody see. She was wearing a mini skirt. I wasn't complaining though. That's what he was saying. Live on TV this morning on one of the most watched breakfast news programs. When we let that kind of sexist nonsense go unchallenged, these things all become more of an issue. And it's our role, which is why there is obviously an irony that we're also sat here talking about this, but it is our responsibility as well to tackle this stuff. So I mean, we just got to keep hammering away at it, I think, and listen to people's experiences. And
it would be worse if we hadn't brought it up at all, I think.
For sure, because it's an easy story to ignore. I think
it
like Riley, like you say, it is easy to go, this is just more woke nonsense, and ignore it. And really, there is something kind of important that is underpinned by it, like there is with all these sort of societal issues, and engaging with it, even though it can be challenging at times, I think, because you have to sort of be a bit introspective, is the first step to solve some of these issues.
Yeah, for sure. Let me move on to quick fire questions.
Cool.
The first one is quick and simple. Should the monarchy be abolished?
Yes.
No. But that's not a really firm no. That's like I could probably be swayed. No. Turn it into a Wetherspoons.
See, I think I was more on the side of yes, but then I think you partly helped in convince me that if it was legislated better, if the monarchy was purely there for show, and not necessarily had anything to do with legislation or laws, like in some other countries. I know, like Monaco, for example, there's a principality, but their head of state is purely there for show. I think
they're also a useful diplomatic tool as well,
sure.
which we didn't mention earlier.
Then again, I'd still have to be convinced that the moral argument would be fixed, and
Sure.
that they would tackle those issues, but and treat them more as human beings, and also that they wouldn't be, just living off of millions of pounds and have, I don't want all of our taxpayer money to go towards them if they're not really doing much. My second question would be, will print media still exist in 50 years? And by print media, I mean newspapers, tabloids.
Physical.
Yeah, the physical thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna say yes.
No.
I think I would say yes as well. I did media studies as a course, and I think we had lots of conversations about it declining, and I think I would have thought then that that it would still be around, but yeah, I don't know. I feel like
I think there's still a market for it, and that maybe 50 years is a long time.
it evolves, right? It doesn't.
Maybe, yeah, we'll all be wearing contact lenses then. That
maybe.
Yeah,
Yeah.
when there's a hologram that comes out.
Chips in our brain.
Yeah.
I can instantly bring up the Mail Online. Great.
Yeah.
My third question is: should school days be extended? This is inspired by Gavin Williamson's suggestion.
No.
Should they be extended? Yeah, I mean, I would say no as well, because I think there's only I hated school as a kid anyway, but I think there's only a certain amount of time in the day that you can stay properly, focused on something. So
exactly. Well, but it's also like, let's not fix the really out of date curriculum, and let's not tackle all the issues that are encompassed under school. What we should do is just make people be there for longer. That's not going to fix any issues. It's just going to exacerbate all the issues that are already there.
The evidence usually shows that working fewer hours generally improves your productivity, your ability to learn. So it's kind of the arguments for the opposite, really.
Yeah. My fourth question is 1 pillow or 2?
4.
4?
I'll tell you my sleeping arrangement, right? I've got 2 pillows that I've got my head on. Then I have a pillow, so I'm like this, right? So my head's on 2 pillows, yeah? And then I've got a pillow next to me, and then
to cuddle.
I'll pop a proper pillow here. That's how I sleep. So I utilize all 4 pillows. Selfish, maybe, but it's really comfortable.
What about you, Riley?
I don't know. This is the one I'm having trouble with. Isn't that strange? I'm going to say 2. Yeah.
2. Yeah.
Who sleeps on 1 pillow? What sort of weak-necked person only needs 1 pillow?
Well, it depends how fluffy the pillow is, though, right?
No.
No?
What, a giant pillow?
I've seen them. Yeah, they exist. They're quite.
How many do you sleep on, Brett?
2 as well, but mine are really thin, so so I need to. But isn't there
the hard-hitting issue?
Yeah. These are the questions that normally cause the most debate.
Yeah.
My final question is, what's your favorite herb?
If I say herb de Provence, is that cheating?
Kind of. It's a mixture of herbs, isn't it? Herb de
yeah,
Provence.
Right. Basil, then.
Basil. All right. I'd say rosemary.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Is chives a herb?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
That's a herb. Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you just pluck out a random herb, Riley?
Just looking around the room for any herb.
To be honest, my question was inspired by the fact that my girlfriend Kate has bought a bunch of herbs to plant in pots, and they're behind my computer as we speak. So
you are now coming up with quickfire questions on the fly.
Oh,
We've finally got to that point.
What do you mean now? This has been the case for ages. Thank you so much for joining us today, Riley. It's been a really good conversation.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to speak to you, mate.
Can I ask?
Do you want to plug your socials? We'll put them in the description, but if you want to plug anything, then now's your time.
I mean, yeah, my Twitter is @RileyToBombito. Don't make fun of me. I made it when I was 12, and I can't. I don't have the heart to change it. Yeah, that's me.
We'll put that in the description. Is there, in honor of International Women's Day, because it was yesterday and we're doing a bunch of content and it's Women's History Month, are there any women in your life that inspire you, or any women in popular the public life that inspire you? Would you say?
I answered a couple of these. No, Riley, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh,
Wasn't meant
sorry.
for you,
Yeah, I was
Jack.
just going to say my sisters. They're identical twins, and they have dwarfism. They have achondroplasia, and they never cease to amaze me. Honestly, at the level of bravery, because there's mockery and there's staring, and they all just take it in their stride. They actually had a TV show even
Wow.
on CBBC, yeah, and they just wanted to raise awareness, and they really inspire me. And I'd say in public life, I'd probably say Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I think, is quite an inspiring figure for me.
Nice. It's really a really good answer. Tearjerker almost. Great. Well, thank you so much, Riley, and thank you, Jack, as well.
Yeah, thank you, mate. No, it's a pleasure. It's always a pleasure.
We'll see you all next week.
Yeah, like and subscribe, Brett.
Shit. Every time I forget. Like and subscribe. And check out our other videos as well while you're at it. We'll see you next week. Okay, let's cut there.
Perfect.
Jesus. The endings are so convoluted.
Every time we record this bloody podcast, Brett forgets to tell people to like and subscribe.
I didn't last week. It's just you being here again.
I wasn't here. Yeah.